in the heart of a bustling American city. Nestled between high-rises and neon-lit convenience stores, sat an unassuming but cherished bakery. The place was small, with brick walls painted a warm yellow, and smelled of fresh bread, sweet cream, and spices that seemed to dance in the air. It had no grand sign or flashy lights, yet everyone in the neighborhood knew it simply as Haven's Breads. Owned by the Walker family, the bakery was a beacon of warmth and familiarity. The husband, James, a tall and sturdy man with hands hardened by years of kneading dough, started each day before the sun rose, his focus precise and his heart full of pride for what he'd built with his family. Beside him, his wife, Evelyn, an ever-smiling woman with gentle eyes and a knack for creating pastries that melted in your mouth, greeted customers as if they were extended family. Their love for each other and their craft was evident in every loaf, every pastry, every cake that left their oven. For the Walkers, this bakery was not just a business, it was their legacy. They had spent decades building it, pouring every ounce of themselves into each recipe. Their son, Malcolm, had grown up in the bakery, learning not only the art of baking but also the values his parents lived by: kindness, honesty, and strength in the face of adversity. But as much as Haven's Breads was loved by the community, not everyone welcomed its success. Over the years, a group of local police officers had made it clear that they resented the Walkers' presence. These officers, hardened by their prejudices, would often linger outside the bakery, sometimes entering only to inspect the place under thinly veiled pretenses. They'd leave behind a trail of disdainful stares and murmurs, an almost palpable reminder of the invisible walls they wished to build around this family. At first, James and Evelyn had tried to overlook the officers' behavior, hoping it would pass. But the hostility grew. Sometimes, the police would park right outside the bakery, blocking customers from entering, claiming they were handling a disturbance. Other times, they would question customers about what they had seen or heard inside, subtly intimidating them. Word of the police's behavior spread, and while the community remained loyal to the Walkers, there was a noticeable decline in foot traffic, especially from people who were less familiar with the family. Despite everything, James and Evelyn continued with quiet resilience. They believed in hard work and the goodness of people. One day, they'll see us for who we really are, Evelyn would say, wiping flour from her hands as she gazed out the window with a look of hope. But James, though he never voiced it, had grown weary. Each encounter with the officers gnawed at him, leaving him with a sense of helplessness that was hard to shake. Malcolm watched his parents with a mixture of admiration and anger. He had always respected their strength, but the unfairness of the situation grated at him. Why should they have to endure this? Why couldn't they just live their lives without fear of harassment? As he grew older, Malcolm's frustration evolved into a resolve. He had seen the struggles his parents faced daily, and he was determined to do something about it. He decided to join the police force, not just to protect his family, but to prove that justice and fairness could prevail even in a system that seemed rigged against people like them. But his journey would not be easy. Joining the force as a black man in a predominantly white department, Malcolm encountered resistance and prejudice at every turn. Yet he persisted, driven by the memory of his parents' quiet strength and the injustices they had endured. Every day, he thought about them, standing alone against those officers, guarding the legacy they had built with their own hands. In the meantime, James and Evelyn continued to pour their hearts into Haven's Breads, serving their community, smiling at each customer, and holding on to the hope that one day, their son would bring about the change they so desperately needed in the heart of a bustling American city. Nestled between towering high-rises and convenience stores, stood an unassuming but beloved bakery. Haven's Breads. The building's brick walls, painted a welcoming shade of yellow, radiated warmth on even the coldest mornings. And the aroma of fresh bread and sweet cream drifted through the streets like a silent invitation. For James and Evelyn Walker, the bakery was more than a business, it was a sanctuary. A legacy. And a testament to everything they had worked for in life. James, a tall, muscular man with hands worn from years of hard labor, had built the bakery from the ground up with his wife. Each day, he woke hours before dawn, his feet moving instinctively across the cool floor, his hands reaching for bags of flour, sugar, and spices. As he prepared the first batch of dough in silence, this ritual was his way of anchoring himself, of reminding himself of all that mattered. His wife, Evelyn, was his anchor. Too, a woman with a constant, warm smile and an infectious laugh. Though she had a quiet nature, her presence was undeniable, filling the bakery with love and a certain peace that people could feel the moment they stepped through the doors. Their bakery became a community haven, known not only for its flaky pastries and perfectly crusted breads but for the kindness that radiated from the Walkers themselves. People came to Haven's Breads for more than just food, they came for conversation, for laughter, and for the feeling of being at home. Children grew up stopping by for Evelyn's famous chocolate chip cookies, couples shared their first dates over slices of her decadent cakes, elderly customers cherished the comforting routine of their morning coffee and croissant. But the success of Haven's Breads was not celebrated by everyone in the neighborhood. Beneath the bakery's warmth lay a troubling shadow, a small but powerful group of police officers who seemed to view the Walkers' achievements as a threat rather than a triumph. Their resentment manifested in quiet but persistent acts of harassment. Reminders that, despite the Walkers' hard work, they were not fully welcome. At first, the officers would stand outside, casting disapproving glances through the windows as they passed by, their eyes sharp with disdain. Then, the harassment grew bolder. They'd enter the bakery under the pretense of inspections, prowling through the kitchen as if expecting to find something amiss, leaving only after intimidating the staff and inspecting every nook and cranny with an exaggerated thoroughness. Each visit left a bitter taste in James and Evelyn's mouths, a sense of violation that lingered long after the officers left. Yet, for all the tension, James and Evelyn did not speak out. They had learned, over the years, the painful lesson that complaints from people like them could often be more dangerous than the harassment itself. So, they bore it in silence, continuing to greet their customers with smiles and warmth, even as their hearts grew heavy. Their son, Malcolm, however, could not accept this quiet resignation. He had grown up witnessing the subtle and overt ways in which his parents had been treated differently, and each encounter with the officers sparked a fire within him that he struggled to contain. He saw the quiet anger in his father's clenched jaw, the sadness in his mother's eyes as she watched their customers being questioned at the door. Every slight, every sneer from the officers, was a reminder that, no matter how hard they worked, his family was seen as other. As a teenager, Malcolm had once confronted an officer who had been particularly aggressive with one of his parents' elderly customers. He demanded to know why they were being targeted, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. But the officer had merely sneered, dismissing him with a patronizing remark that stung Malcolm to his core. From that moment, he knew he had to do something, to find a way to protect his family, even if it meant stepping into a world he didn't fully trust. In his early 20s, Malcolm made a decision that shocked his family. He applied to join the police force. He could still remember the look in his father's eyes the night he broke the news, a mixture of pride and fear. as if James knew both the honor and the danger of what his son was about to undertake. "Are you sure about this, Malcolm?" James had asked, his voice heavy with concern. "Yes, Dad," Malcolm had replied, his voice firm. "Someone needs to stand up. Someone needs to change things from the inside." And so, Malcolm embarked on a journey that was both daunting and isolating. He faced resistance from the moment he entered the academy, encountering prejudice not just from his peers, but from some of his instructors, who made no attempt to hide their skepticism about his motives. Yet, he persevered. Each grueling day, each exhausting shift, he reminded himself why he was there: to bring justice, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, to stand up for people like his family who had endured years of silent suffering. In the years that followed, Malcolm climbed the ranks, earning respect through his unwavering integrity and dedication. But his journey was far from easy. He had to prove himself over and over, working twice as hard to gain half the acknowledgement his colleagues received. Still, he remained steadfast, his mind always drifting back to his parents and the legacy they had built. A legacy he was determined to protect. Back at Haven's Breads, James and Evelyn continued their routine, oblivious to the transformation their son was undergoing. They heard whispers from customers about the new recruit in the force, about how he was a rising star and was gaining a reputation for fairness. But even as their pride in Malcolm grew, so did their worry. They knew the weight of the responsibility he had taken on, and they feared for his safety in a world where those who challenged the status quo were often met with resistance. Despite their fears, the Walkers held on to hope, finding solace in the knowledge that, no matter what happened, they had raised a son who was brave enough to face the world with his head held high. And in the quiet moments, when the bakery was empty and the only sound was the hum of the ovens, they would share a quiet smile, a silent prayer, and a fierce, unspoken promise to keep fighting for their family, for their bakery, and for the justice that Malcolm had dedicated his life to achieving. But as the sun set each day and the streetlights flickered on outside, James couldn't shake a lingering sense of dread. He knew that their family's story was far from over and that the real fight was yet to come in a corner of the bustling city. Between tall buildings and graffiti-tagged storefronts, Haven's Breads stood like a rare gem. The small, weathered bakery had become more than just a shop. It was a symbol of resilience, love, and a community's heartbeat. James Walker and his wife, Evelyn, had poured their hearts into every brick, every flour-dusted counter, and every recipe. Their baked goods weren't just food, they were memories, hopes, and stories wrapped in warmth. James, a man with hands calloused from years of baking, knew the weight of early mornings. Before the world woke, he'd be in the bakery, sleeves rolled up, kneading dough under dim lights while the sun slowly spilled into the kitchen. Inch by inch, he had a ritualistic respect for the process, the flouring, the measuring, the waiting. This was his life, his legacy. Each loaf, each roll, held the same care as the first batch he'd ever baked. Evelyn had a gentleness about her, a calm strength that steadied the atmosphere around her. With soft eyes and a voice that could soothe even the most troubled heart, she greeted each customer like family. She remembered names, birthdays, favorite treats. She was the kind of person who could turn a brief conversation into a lasting memory. And that was why people loved her. They didn't just come for the pastries, they came for the warmth and kindness Evelyn radiated. Their son, Malcolm, was raised in this environment of flour-covered aprons and simmering kindness. Even as a child, he saw the beauty in his parents' work, and he felt pride when locals stopped by just to chat or say hello. But Malcolm also noticed the undercurrent of tension in their lives, the way his parents would exchange weary glances when the police officers walked by, or the way his mother's smile faltered whenever she saw one of them parked outside the bakery, watching with cold, calculating eyes. The officers rarely said much, but their presence alone was enough to unsettle everyone in the bakery. They would stand near the entrance, hands resting on their belts, eyes scanning the customers, as if looking for a reason to cause trouble. It was never outright harassment, it was a slow, simmering intimidation. A way of reminding the walkers that they didn't belong in the same way their customers did. In the early years, James had tried to confront the officers, to stand his ground. "Why are you here?" he'd asked one evening. His voice steady but his jaw clenched. "Routine inspection," one of them had said with a smirk. "Just doing our job." But the inspections had continued. And eventually, James learned that resistance only seemed to make them stay longer. He'd returned to Evelyn's side, his hands gripping the countertop, trying to mask his frustration for the sake of his customers. "Just ignore them," Evelyn would whisper, resting a hand on his arm. "They're looking for a reaction. Don't give it to them." But for Malcolm, it wasn't so easy to ignore. He saw the way those officers looked at his parents, how they seemed to take pleasure in their discomfort. He couldn't understand why anyone would want to hurt people like his mom and dad, people who only wanted to make an honest living, to serve their community, and to spread kindness. The thought festered inside him, growing from frustration into anger, and then into resolve. The walkers rarely talked about these things openly, especially around Malcolm. But he saw enough. One evening, when he was about 15, he'd been helping his father close up the bakery when a pair of officers walked in, looking around as though they were entering enemy territory. They picked up a loaf of bread, inspecting it closely as though expecting to find something wrong. "Is there a problem?" James asked, his voice respectful but firm. "No problem," one of the officers replied, setting the loaf back down with a smirk. "Just checking that everything's up to code." Malcolm could feel his pulse quickening as he watched the exchange. He saw the way his father's fists clenched, the subtle tension in his posture. But James remained calm, refusing to give the officers the reaction they wanted. And that, perhaps, was what infuriated Malcolm the most, that his parents had to live with this constant, quiet terror. And yet they had no choice but to endure it in silence. That night, Malcolm lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He'd always respected his father's strength, his ability to remain calm under pressure. But part of him wondered if there was another way, a way to fight back without letting these officers have the upper hand. He'd grown up hearing about the values of fairness and justice, about standing up for what was right. And he couldn't reconcile those ideals with the way his family was being treated. Over the years, the tension only grew. The officers continued their inspections, sometimes questioning customers, subtly intimidating anyone who dared to linger too long. The walkers knew the impact it was having. Some of their regular customers stopped coming, fearful of being harassed themselves. It was a slow, insidious erosion of the community they had worked so hard to build. But through it all, the walkers held their heads high. They continued to serve their community with the same kindness and warmth as they always had. Even as the harassment took its toll, Evelyn would greet each customer with a smile. James would focus on his work, and Malcolm would watch, silently vowing to do something to protect them. When Malcolm was in his late teens, he announced his decision to join the police force. His parents had been shocked, to say the least. Evelyn had looked at him with a mixture of pride and concern, while James had been more reserved, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure about this, son?" he'd asked. his voice quiet but firm. "Yes, Dad," Malcolm replied, his eyes unwavering. "I want to make a difference. I want to help people like us." His parents exchanged a glance. A silent communication that Malcolm couldn't fully understand. But they didn't try to dissuade him. They understood that this was something he needed to do. Something that had been building within him for years. And so, with a heavy heart, they supported him. Even as they worried about the challenges he would face. Malcolm's journey through the police academy was far from easy. He faced prejudice from his peers and instructors alike. And he quickly realized that the same biases he had witnessed outside the academy walls were deeply ingrained within the institution itself. But he refused to be deterred. He trained harder, studied longer, and pushed himself to the limit, determined to prove himself not only to his superiors but to himself. His parents watched his progress with a mixture of pride and fear. Knowing the risks he was taking but also understanding the fire that drove him. They continued to run the bakery. Their hearts filled with hope that one day, Malcolm would bring about the change they had dreamed of for so long. As Malcolm rose through the ranks, he began to make a name for himself as a fair and honest officer. He was known for his integrity, for his refusal to turn a blind eye to wrongdoing, no matter the source. And though his journey was fraught with challenges, he remained steadfast, guided by the memory of his parents and the legacy they had built. Back at Haven's Breads, James and Evelyn continued to hold the fort, enduring the harassment with quiet dignity. Even as they felt the weight of Malcolm's absence, they knew he was fighting for them in his own way. And they took solace in the knowledge that, no matter what happened, they had raised a son who was brave enough to stand up for what was right. But even as they clung to hope, they couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. They sensed that change was coming. But they didn't know if it would bring relief or more hardship. And as the days passed, they braced themselves for whatever lay ahead, holding on to each other in the small, bright sanctuary they had created within those yellow brick walls. When Malcolm Walker first walked into the police academy, he felt the weight of his family's hopes resting on his shoulders. It wasn't just a career decision, it was a commitment to change. A promise he had made to himself years ago. Yet, from the very beginning, he realized that his path would be anything but easy. On his first day, Malcolm was keenly aware of the stares from other recruits. He could feel the weight of judgment, see the skepticism in their eyes. Some assumed he was there because of diversity quotas. Others muttered under their breath about soft spots in the academy's standards. Malcolm's resolve tightened. But he knew he'd need more than determination to endure the prejudice he'd face daily. For his family. For himself. He steeled himself to prove them all wrong. The academy was rigorous. Malcolm found solace in physical training, letting the intense workouts drown out the murmurs and dismissive glances. He trained harder, studied longer, and stayed later than most. Soon, he earned a reputation not for being the black recruit but as one of the academy's most promising cadets. His perseverance, however, did not erase the barriers he faced. Despite his successes, he was often overlooked. His accomplishments dismissed or overshadowed by those who doubted him. Through it all, he thought of his parents. He thought of his father's quiet resilience. The way he'd clenched his jaw but remained calm when the officers loitered around Haven's Breads. He thought of his mother's warm smile. The one that rarely faltered. Even when she knew she was being watched. Judged. Malcolm's anger simmered beneath the surface. But he kept it in check. Channeling it into his training, his studies, and his determination to reach a position where he could make a difference. When Malcolm finally graduated from the academy, his parents were there, beaming with pride. James wore a suit, and Evelyn's face shone with pride and love. She embraced her son tightly, whispering, "You did it. You did it, Malcolm." For the Walkers, that day was a victory. A step toward justice. But Malcolm knew his journey had only just begun. As a rookie officer, Malcolm faced a harsh reality. He was partnered with officers who often held the very prejudices he had sworn to combat. Some openly questioned his ability to handle certain situations, subtly implying that he was too soft to be effective. Others would make thinly veiled comments about the neighborhoods he patrolled, stereotyping the very people he sought to protect. Every shift felt like a test, not just of his abilities, but of his resolve to remain true to his values in a system that seemed determined to test him at every turn. One night, while patrolling the streets, Malcolm and his partner, Officer Garrett, a veteran known for his hardened attitude, were called to a disturbance near Haven's Breads. Malcolm's pulse quickened as they approached the bakery. Even in the dim streetlight, he could see the familiar yellow bricks and the soft glow from inside, where his parents were no doubt preparing for the next day's early morning rush. When they arrived, Malcolm saw that two officers, ones he recognized from his childhood as the very men who had harassed his family for years, were already there. Speaking with his father, James stood with his arms crossed, his expression calm but firm. Malcolm noticed the tension in his father's shoulders, the way his eyes flickered with a mix of defiance and exhaustion. As he approached, Malcolm heard one of the officers, Officer Dugan, say, "We had reports of some suspicious activity in the area. Just making sure everything's in order." James replied evenly, "There's nothing suspicious here, Officer Dugan. Just a bakery. Like always." Malcolm felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he kept his face neutral. This was a moment he had prepared for. Yet he hadn't anticipated the rush of emotions seeing his father under the scrutiny of those who had tormented his family for so long. He stepped forward, his posture professional but firm. "Everything is fine here, Officer," Malcolm said, his tone calm yet commanding. He glanced at his father, giving him a subtle nod. "Let's clear this area and move along." The officers exchanged glances, their surprise evident. They hadn't expected to see Malcolm, the boy they once taunted, now wearing the same uniform, wielding authority over them. Officer Dugan smirked, the same condescending look Malcolm remembered all too well. But he backed away, muttering, "Just doing our job." As they walked away, Malcolm felt the weight of his father's gaze. James nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, but said nothing. It was a moment they both understood. Malcolm was no longer just the son of a baker, he was someone with the power to protect his family. Someone who had earned his place, not through anger or vengeance, but through relentless persistence. The encounter lit a fire within Malcolm, strengthening his resolve. Over the following years, he continued to work his way up, earning respect not only from his fellow officers but from the community. He became known as a fair, firm presence on the force, someone who treated everyone with respect and dignity, regardless of their background. But his journey was still fraught with challenges. The closer he came to achieving influence within the force, the more he encountered resistance from those who saw his integrity as a threat. He uncovered cases of misconduct and prejudice that were swept under the rug. Seeing firsthand how deep the issues ran within the system, Malcolm knew that bringing change would require more than just his own actions, it would require a reckoning. A confrontation with the very culture that had allowed officers like Dugan to operate unchecked for so long. As he rose to the position of sergeant, Malcolm's influence grew, and he began quietly assembling a group of like-minded officers, people who believed in fairness, in the duty to serve and protect all citizens, not just those who fit a certain profile. Together, They worked to hold their fellow officers accountable, pushing for reforms, advocating for transparency. It was a slow, often frustrating process. But Malcolm saw glimmers of progress. Complaints that would have once been ignored were now investigated. And officers who abused their power faced consequences, however small. Yet, for every victory, there were setbacks. Malcolm encountered constant resistance. Subtle reminders from those in power that he was pushing against traditions deeply embedded in the force. Some warned him to stay in line, others hinted that his career could easily be derailed if he didn't go along to get along. But Malcolm refused to back down. His motivation remained unwavering, rooted in the memories of his family's struggles, in the resilience of his parents, who had faced injustice with quiet strength for years. Then, one day, a turning point arrived that changed everything. The police chief announced his retirement. And to everyone's surprise, Malcolm was named as one of the candidates to replace him. It was an unexpected recognition of his work, a sign that his efforts had not gone unnoticed. But Malcolm knew this was not just an opportunity, it was a test, a chance to reshape the culture of the force. Or perhaps, a trap set by those who doubted he would succeed. In the weeks leading up to the final decision, Malcolm faced more challenges than ever before. Old prejudices resurfaced. Whispers circulated about his agenda, and some officers even attempted to undermine his candidacy with rumors and false reports. Yet, through it all, Malcolm remained focused, his resolve unshaken. When the announcement finally came, the city gathered to hear the news. Standing before a crowd that included his parents, fellow officers, and community members, Malcolm Walker was named the new police chief. In that moment, as the weight of his achievement settled upon him, Malcolm felt a mix of pride, relief, and a deep, unshakable responsibility. He knew this position was more than a title, it was a commitment to his family, to his community, to the ideals he had carried with him since he was a boy standing in that bakery, watching his parents face injustice with quiet dignity. As he looked out at the crowd, his eyes found his parents, who stood side by side, their faces filled with pride and tears. In that moment, he knew that his journey was just beginning, and that the fight for justice was far from over. But he was no longer alone. With the authority of his new position and the support of his community, Malcolm Walker prepared to confront the challenges that lay ahead. Determined to bring justice to a system that had long denied it. The first few months after Malcolm graduated from the police academy were some of the most challenging of his life. As a rookie, he was assigned to basic patrols, usually alongside senior officers who seemed indifferent at best, or hostile at worst, to his presence. Malcolm quickly learned the unspoken codes, the biases and backroom politics that shaped the department. His mind often drifted back to Haven's Breads, where his parents were busy baking long before dawn, in the neighborhood that welcomed him like family, yet was viewed with suspicion by many of his colleagues. Every shift reminded him why he had chosen this path, even as he felt the weight of isolation pressing in on him. One of the senior officers, a wiry man named Officer Connolly, became Malcolm's first regular partner. Connolly was known for his brusque demeanor and quick temper, and it didn't take long for Malcolm to feel the tension between them. Connolly rarely spoke to him outside of official matters, and when he did, it was often laced with condescension. For weeks, Malcolm endured this treatment in silence, knowing that anything he said could easily be twisted against him. Then, one evening, they were patrolling a particularly busy part of the city when they spotted a young man being harassed outside a convenience store. Malcolm could tell the man was scared, his hands held up defensively as he pleaded with the store owner. Without waiting for Connolly's instruction, Malcolm approached. his voice calm but firm, diffusing the situation before it could escalate. Connolly sneered, muttering under his breath about letting things slide. But the store owner thanked Malcolm, shaking his hand with a look of relief. That incident marked a turning point. From that day on, Connolly's treatment of Malcolm grew colder, his contempt barely concealed. But Malcolm refused to let it deter him. Instead, he began to reach out to the community during his patrols, speaking to shop owners, checking in on locals, building the kind of relationships that he believed policing was supposed to be about. He wanted to be a protector, not an enforcer, a difference he knew his colleagues didn't always understand. Meanwhile, Malcolm's dedication did not go unnoticed by the few officers who shared his values. One of them was Officer Rachel Flores, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for compassion and a commitment to fairness. She'd grown up in a similarly marginalized neighborhood and understood the tension Malcolm faced daily. Over time, they developed a quiet camaraderie, bonded by their shared experiences and mutual respect. Flores became not just an ally but a confidant, someone Malcolm could trust when he felt the weight of the department's indifference pressing down on him. "You're fighting an uphill battle. You know that, right?" she said one afternoon as they grabbed a quick coffee break during a shift. Malcolm nodded, staring into his cup. "I know. But if I don't fight it, who will?" Flores smiled, a touch of admiration in her gaze. "You're brave, Malcolm. This place could use more people like you." Those words stayed with him, a reminder that he wasn't alone. With Flores's support, Malcolm began to push boundaries, speaking out more boldly against the casual prejudice he saw around him. It was risky, but Malcolm understood that real change required courage. He couldn't sit back and watch as his colleagues treated people in his community with suspicion, the way those officers had treated his family years ago. However, this newfound resolve came at a cost. The more Malcolm spoke out, the more he became a target. Rumors circulated, whispers spread, and his actions were scrutinized by superiors who saw his integrity as a disruption to the department's culture. It was as if his every move was under surveillance, every decision dissected and questioned. His commitment to justice felt like a double-edged sword. The more he tried to do good, the more he was seen as a threat. One day, he was summoned to the office of Captain Rayburn, a grizzled officer with a no-nonsense reputation. The captain eyed Malcolm from behind his desk, his expression unreadable. "Walker," Rayburn began, his tone cold and measured. "I've been hearing things. Some of the men say you're stirring the pot. You know, pushing for changes that may not be necessary." Malcolm took a breath, meeting the captain's gaze with steady resolve. "Sir, I believe that protecting our community means treating people with respect, no matter where they come from. If that's stirring the pot, then so be it." Rayburn's expression hardened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he nodded curtly and dismissed Malcolm with a wave. As Malcolm left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed an invisible line. Despite the mounting pressure, Malcolm remained undeterred. His time off duty became precious moments of solace spent with his family, especially with his father, who had always been his quiet anchor. James was careful not to ask too much, sensing the unspoken tension his son was carrying. But he knew that Malcolm's journey was one he had to face alone, just as James had borne the struggles of the bakery in silence. One evening, Malcolm returned to Haven's Breads after a particularly grueling shift. He found his father in the kitchen, rolling out dough with a slow, practiced rhythm. James looked up, giving Malcolm a nod, and without a word, handed him a rolling pin. Together, they worked in silence, the familiar scent of flour and yeast filling the air. After a while, James spoke, his voice low and steady. "You're doing something important, Malcolm. But remember, justice isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's in the quiet things we do every day." Malcolm nodded, absorbing his father's words. In that moment, he realized that his father's resilience, his quiet defiance against a world that had tried to break him, was its own kind of justice. It wasn't about grand gestures or speeches, it was about standing firm in his convictions. Even when no one else understood. Months turned into years. And Malcolm continued to climb the ranks, his reputation growing within the department and the community alike. He became a sergeant, then a lieutenant, and eventually, he was recommended for a captaincy. With each promotion, he gained more influence, but he also felt the weight of greater scrutiny. The higher he rose, the more resistance he encountered, especially from those who saw his rise as a challenge to the established order. Then came the day when the chief of police announced his retirement. Rumors swirled about who would replace him. And to Malcolm's surprise, his name was among the candidates. The community rallied behind him, recognizing him as a symbol of integrity and fairness. His colleagues, however, were divided. Some supported him, knowing he was the right person for the job. Others, particularly those who held on to outdated beliefs, viewed his candidacy with suspicion. In the final weeks before the announcement, Malcolm poured his energy into his work, remaining steadfast in his commitment to justice. He knew that this position was more than a title, it was a chance to make a lasting impact. But he also knew it would come with its own set of challenges. If he was chosen, he would be stepping into a role where every decision, every action, would be scrutinized. He would be representing not just himself but everyone who had ever been denied justice. Everyone who had ever felt the weight of prejudice. Finally, the day arrived. The city gathered at the precinct. Community members, fellow officers, and city officials alike, all awaiting the announcement. Malcolm stood among the candidates, his heart pounding as he scanned the crowd, searching for his parents. When he found them, his mother gave him a reassuring smile, and his father nodded, a silent message of pride and strength. When his name was called, a wave of emotion washed over him. He had done it. He had become the police chief, not through force or anger, but through resilience and an unwavering commitment to justice. As he stepped forward to accept his new role, he glanced at his parents, feeling the years of struggle, sacrifice, and quiet strength that had brought him to this moment. For Malcolm, this was only the beginning. He knew that his work had just begun, that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But as he looked out at the faces in the crowd, he felt a surge of hope. He had earned his place, not only in the department but in the community he had vowed to protect. And with his new authority, he was prepared to confront the forces that had long gone unchecked, to bring justice not just for his family but for all those who had been denied it. As he stepped off the stage, Malcolm was approached by Flores, who gave him a proud smile. "We did it," she said, a note of pride in her voice. "No," Malcolm replied, his gaze firm. "We're just getting started." And with that, Malcolm Walker prepared to lead his city into a new era of justice, determined to prove that change was possible even in the face of a history steeped in prejudice. When Malcolm Walker accepted the position of police chief, he knew the weight of the responsibility he was taking on. It wasn't just about wearing the title or holding authority, it was about proving that justice could be brought to a place where it had often been denied. And he knew, as he walked into his new office for the first time, that his biggest battles still lay ahead. He had spent his first days as chief observing, getting a feel for the precinct's inner workings. He reviewed files on long-ignored complaints, examined reports that had been quietly shelved, and paid close attention to officers who had repeatedly been accused of misconduct, including familiar names like Officer Dugan and Officer Connolly. He could see, in black and white, how many issues had been swept under the rug, how the department had maintained its own brand of order by keeping certain officers insulated from consequence. Malcolm knew that confronting these men directly would be dangerous. Many of them held influence over others within the precinct. Having established a network of loyalty through years of shared secrets and unspoken rules, dismantling this ingrained system would require patience, strategy, and a fierce dedication to the principles he had carried with him his entire career. But Malcolm was done waiting. His first step was to establish a new internal review committee, one with a clear mandate to investigate all complaints, regardless of the officer's rank or connections. He brought in outside oversight, inviting respected community leaders and independent reviewers to ensure transparency. This move alone sent shockwaves through the precinct, with many officers reacting with suspicion and resentment. But Malcolm was undeterred. He'd learned over the years that real change required bold, uncomfortable steps, and he was ready to take them. The tension in the precinct grew palpable in the days following Malcolm's confrontation with Officers Dugan and Connolly. Word of the incident had spread quickly, sparking whispers among the officers, most of whom had never seen a chief so openly challenge his subordinates. Malcolm was aware that every eye was on him, waiting to see how he would handle the fallout. To some, he was a threat to a long-standing culture that had operated without oversight for far too long. To others, especially the newer recruits, he was a sign that the old ways were finally being challenged. The next morning, as promised, Dugan and Connolly arrived in Malcolm's office. Dugan wore a smug look, but Malcolm could see the unease lurking behind his eyes. Connolly, on the other hand, was defiant, crossing his arms as he settled into the chair, his gaze fixed on Malcolm with open hostility. "Gentlemen," Malcolm began, his tone steady. "What happened last night was unacceptable. This department operates under a duty to protect, not to harm. Your actions have not only jeopardized the safety of the citizens we're supposed to serve, but they've also tarnished the reputation of this entire force." Dugan shifted in his seat, scoffing slightly. "Chief, with all due respect, we were doing what's necessary to keep the streets safe. Sometimes you need to be tough to keep people in line. You of all people should know that." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. Necessary force does not mean excessive force. We're here to serve and protect, not to intimidate and dominate. I am placing both of you on administrative leave pending a full investigation." Connolly shot up from his chair, his face flushed with anger. "Administrative leave? You're making a big mistake. Chief, we're not the ones you should be worrying about." Malcolm's gaze didn't falter. "This isn't a negotiation. Connolly, this is a new standard. And every single officer on this force, will be held to it. If you don't believe in that standard, you're free to leave." The room fell silent as Connolly clenched his fists. But eventually, he backed down, muttering under his breath as he left the office with Dugan following close behind. Malcolm felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew this was only a temporary victory. Dugan and Connolly weren't just individual officers, they represented a mindset that was deeply rooted within the department, one that wouldn't disappear overnight. Over the next several weeks, Malcolm continued his reforms, implementing new policies to promote transparency and accountability. He established a dedicated unit for community outreach, assigning officers to work directly with neighborhood leaders and local businesses. He also initiated a citizen review board to oversee complaints against the police, ensuring that any allegations of misconduct would be thoroughly investigated by an impartial panel. As word of these changes spread, Malcolm began to feel a shift in the atmosphere. Community members who had once been wary of the police now felt encouraged to come forward, sharing stories of past injustices and expressing hope for a new chapter. The turnout at local town hall meetings grew, with residents openly discussing their concerns, knowing that their voices were being heard. For the first time in years, Malcolm felt that the bridge between the community and the police was being rebuilt, brick by brick. But while the community supported him, Malcolm's actions were met with increased hostility within the force. Anonymous threats began to appear in his mailbox, and his car tires were slashed more than once. One night, he returned to his office to find a note scrawled on his desk: "You don't belong here. Walk away while you still can." Each threat only strengthened his resolve. But he knew he couldn't ignore the risks. Malcolm had seen too many good officers driven out by intimidation, by the invisible walls that kept them in line with the unspoken rules of the old guard. He wasn't about to let that happen to him. But he also knew he couldn't do this alone. Officer Rachel Flores remained one of his strongest allies, standing by his side through every challenge. Together, they worked to build a coalition of officers who believed in Malcolm's vision. They met quietly, after hours, discussing ways to support the reforms, identifying officers who could be trusted, and strategizing about how to tackle resistance from within. One evening, as Malcolm and Flores sat in a dimly lit diner discussing their next steps, she leaned across the table, her voice barely above a whisper. "Malcolm, this isn't just pushback anymore. Some of these guys are getting desperate. You need to watch your back." Malcolm nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she was right. The threats had escalated, and he could sense the growing desperation among the officers who resisted his changes. But he also knew that backing down now would mean surrendering everything he had worked for. "I'm not backing down, Rachel," he said quietly. "We've come too far for that." Flores smiled, a look of fierce determination in her eyes. "Good. Because neither am I." Their alliance strengthened. And slowly, Malcolm began to see the ripple effects of their work. More officers started attending the community outreach programs, some even volunteering for initiatives that had once been viewed with skepticism. The Citizen Review Board became an integral part of the precinct's operations, and complaints of misconduct decreased as officers became more mindful of their actions, knowing they were being held accountable. Yet, amid these victories, Malcolm sensed that a final confrontation was inevitable. He knew that officers like Dugan and Connolly wouldn't go down quietly, and he could feel the tension building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Then, one night, the storm finally broke. Malcolm received a late-night call from dispatch about a disturbance near his parents' bakery, Haven's Breads. His heart skipped a beat as he listened to the details. A group of men had been spotted outside the bakery, making threats, demanding that the Walkers close up shop. Malcolm didn't need to hear more. He grabbed his keys and headed out, his mind racing as he sped through the empty streets. When he arrived, he found his parents standing outside the bakery, flanked by a handful of neighbors who had gathered in support. Dugan, Connolly, and a few other officers stood nearby, their postures tense, their expressions hard. "What's going on here?" Malcolm demanded as he approached, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the crowd. Dugan smirked, crossing his arms. "Just checking in on a disturbance, Chief. Got a call about some suspicious activity." Malcolm's gaze was steely. "The only disturbance here is you. I suggest you and your friends leave, now." Connolly sneered, stepping forward. Is that a threat, Chief? Or just a suggestion? Malcolm took a step closer, his voice low and unyielding. It's an order. Officer Connolly. Disperse immediately, or I'll have you all brought up on charges. The tension hung thick in the air. But after a moment, Dugan and Connolly exchanged a look, reluctantly stepping back. They muttered curses under their breath as they walked away. But Malcolm didn't care. He turned to his parents, who were watching him with a mixture of pride and relief. Are you two okay? He asked, his voice softening. James nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. We're fine, Malcolm. Thanks to you. As the crowd dispersed, Malcolm stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of everything he had fought for. He knew this wasn't the end. There would be more challenges, more threats, more attempts to undermine his work. But he also knew that he was making a difference, that his fight for justice was not in vain. In the days that followed, Malcolm filed formal complaints against Dugan and Connolly, initiating a thorough investigation that would eventually lead to their dismissal from the force. The process was long and grueling, with countless obstacles. But Malcolm remained unwavering. His reforms continued to reshape the precinct. And slowly, the culture of intimidation and corruption began to fade. The community's trust in the police grew stronger, and Malcolm's relationship with his family deepened. They had weathered the storm together, and in the end, they had emerged stronger, united by a shared resilience that no amount of prejudice or corruption could break. And as Malcolm stood in his office, looking out over the city he had vowed to protect, he knew that his journey was far from over. But for the first time, he felt that justice was within reach, not just for his family, but for everyone who had ever been denied it. The first confrontation came one afternoon, barely a week into his tenure, when Officer Dugan was called into Malcolm's office. Dugan's face was a mask of indifference as he stepped inside. But Malcolm could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. Have a seat, Officer Dugan, Malcolm said, his tone steady. Dugan sat crossing his arms, his mouth set in a thin line. What's this about, Chief? Malcolm didn't hesitate. I'm reviewing several complaints filed against you, spanning over the past decade. Allegations of misconduct, excessive force, and intimidation tactics, including repeated harassment of local business owners. Dugan's jaw tightened, but he managed a smirk. All in a day's work, Chief. Sometimes you gotta get tough to keep the streets clean. Malcolm leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. That's not toughness, Officer Dugan, that's abuse of power. And it won't be tolerated under my watch. The room fell silent, the tension thickening between them. Dugan's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. You think you're going to change things around here? I've been on this force longer than you've been wearing that uniform. You may have the title, but I know how things work in the city. Malcolm's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. Then consider this your warning. If I find even a hint of misconduct, you'll be held accountable. And that goes for every officer under this roof. Dugan stared at him, his face reddening. But he said nothing. With a stiff nod, he stood and left the office, slamming the door behind him. Malcolm watched him go, feeling the weight of the encounter settle over him. This was just the beginning. There would be pushback, resistance, even retaliation, but he knew he couldn't back down. Over the next several weeks, Malcolm worked tirelessly, implementing new protocols for officer conduct, establishing training programs that focused on de-escalation and community relations, and fostering a culture of accountability that had long been absent from the department. He knew that these measures would only work if they were enforced. So he made it clear that any officer caught violating these standards would face immediate disciplinary action. Word spread quickly throughout the city. Community members who had once avoided the precinct now felt emboldened, filing complaints that had gone unreported for years. People began to see Malcolm as a beacon of hope, someone who would finally address the injustices they had endured in silence. But with this new trust came a mounting tension within the force. Officers who had operated with impunity began to realize that their actions had consequences, and some weren't willing to accept this shift without a fight. One evening, as Malcolm was leaving the precinct, he found himself approached by a group of officers, Dugan among them. They blocked his path, their expressions hostile, their bodies tense. "Chief," Dugan sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Heard you've been real busy lately, stirring things up. Gotta wonder how long you think this little reform of yours is going to last." Malcolm looked him squarely in the eyes, refusing to be intimidated. "As long as it takes, Dugan. I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to do my job." Dugan stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Careful, Walker. You start poking around too much, you might find yourself in places you don't belong." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. He understood that this was more than a threat, it was a challenge, a test of his resolve. But he had come too far to be scared off now. "That's the difference between you and me, Dugan," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. "I don't need to threaten people to prove my strength." With that, he pushed past them, his steps calm and measured. Inside, his heart was racing, but he knew he couldn't show fear. These officers thrived on intimidation, on forcing others into silence through fear. But Malcolm had learned from the best, his parents, who had faced oppression with quiet dignity for years. And he was prepared to do the same. As he drove home that night, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a fine line. He was pushing the force in a direction it had resisted for too long. And he knew that the more progress he made, the harder the resistance would become. But he also knew he couldn't stop. The community was counting on him. His family was counting on him. And, most importantly, he was counting on himself to see this through. In the weeks that followed, Malcolm continued his reforms, strengthening ties with community leaders, implementing new oversight committees, and even bringing in outside experts to help transform the department's approach to policing. The pressure from within the force grew more intense, with officers openly challenging his authority, some even going as far as to sabotage initiatives he had put in place. But Malcolm pressed on, his resolve as unbreakable as ever. Then, one night, an incident occurred that forced everything to a head. A young man from Malcolm's neighborhood was stopped by officers for a minor infraction, and things quickly escalated. By the time Malcolm arrived on the scene, he found the young man handcuffed and bruised, his face etched with fear and anger. The officers responsible were none other than Dugan and Connolly, their expressions defiant as they defended their actions as necessary force. Malcolm felt a surge of fury rise within him, but he knew he had to remain composed. He took a deep breath, addressing the officers in a calm, controlled voice. "This ends now," he said, his tone carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "Both of you, report to my office first thing in the morning. We're going to address this thoroughly." Dugan opened his mouth to protest, but Malcolm cut him off with a look that silenced him. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before reluctantly nodding and stepping back. Malcolm turned to the young man, speaking to him with the kindness and respect that he had promised himself he would bring to his work. As he drove home that night, Malcolm realized that this confrontation was inevitable. He had reached the point of no return. His next steps would either solidify the changes he had fought so hard to implement or break everything he had worked for. But as he glanced in his rearview mirror, he saw his reflection. His face set with the same quiet strength he had seen in his father for years. He was ready for whatever came next. Malcolm Walker's rise to police chief marked a turning point in his life. But his journey toward justice wasn't defined solely by his title. It was the culmination of years of silent suffering, resilience, and a fierce determination to reshape a broken system from the inside out. Malcolm had entered the police force with a vision, one born from witnessing his family's struggles, from seeing his parents face harassment with quiet dignity, and from feeling the weight of prejudice in every cold stare, every smirk, and every threat that his family endured. As chief, he was determined to make that vision a reality, even if it meant confronting entrenched corruption and risking everything he'd worked for. The path had been far from easy. From the very beginning, Malcolm faced resistance from officers who viewed him as an outsider, a disruption to the status quo. Officers like Dugan and Connolly, who had harassed his family for years, represented a culture within the precinct that thrived on intimidation and unchecked power. They operated under the assumption that their actions would never have consequences, that the system would protect them as it always had. But under Malcolm's leadership, that system began to change. One of Malcolm's first acts as chief was to implement sweeping reforms aimed at fostering transparency and accountability. He established a citizen review board, giving the community a voice and ensuring that complaints of police misconduct would be taken seriously. He redefined the department's training protocols, emphasizing de-escalation, empathy, and respect. He set a standard that every officer would be expected to follow, a standard that didn't leave room for bias or abuse of power. These reforms were not just policies, they were statements of intent, promises that Malcolm was committed to honoring. But reform didn't come without pushback. Dugan, Connolly, and a handful of other officers who clung to the old ways quickly became Malcolm's most vocal adversaries. They saw his changes as a threat to their authority, and they sought to undermine him at every turn. Threats began to surface, some subtle, others blatant. Malcolm's car tires were slashed. Notes filled with hateful messages were left on his desk, and anonymous phone calls hinted at repercussions if he didn't back down. Each attempt to intimidate him was met with silent resilience, each effort to unnerve him only strengthened his resolve. Malcolm had grown up in a world where quiet courage was a necessity, where his parents' silent strength had shown him the meaning of true resilience. He would not be driven out of his mission. His closest ally, Officer Rachel Flores, stood by his side through it all. Together, they created a coalition of officers who shared his vision for a fair, just department. Officers who believed in the duty to protect all citizens equally. Their unity symbolized a new era within the force, a movement toward something better. It wasn't a fast change, nor was it without its challenges. But it was a shift, a steady, unyielding shift toward justice that Malcolm had dreamed of since his days as a rookie. As Malcolm's reforms took root, the impact on the community was profound. For the first time in years, people felt safe coming forward with their stories, sharing their experiences of injustice and discrimination, and trusting that someone would listen. The community's relationship with the police slowly began to heal, and Haven's Breads became a symbol of this new beginning. Where there had once been intimidation and fear, there was now support and solidarity. The bakery, which had been a target of harassment for so many years, now stood as a beacon of hope. A place where people could gather and know that change was not only possible but already happening. One pivotal moment in Malcolm's journey came when he filed a formal complaint against Dugan and Connolly, initiating an investigation that ultimately led to their dismissal. It was a hard-won victory. one that signaled to the force that the days of unchecked power were over. The investigation process was grueling, filled with legal battles, resistance, and backlash from those who wanted to protect the old guard. But Malcolm's resolve never wavered. He knew that this was not just about two officers, it was about dismantling a culture of fear and ensuring that no family, no business, and no individual would ever have to endure what his family had faced. The community's support became a constant source of strength for Malcolm. At town hall meetings, people would share their gratitude, telling him stories of how his actions had inspired them, how they felt a renewed faith in justice. His parents, James and Evelyn, were especially proud, standing by him through every challenge. Their support a silent, unwavering testament to the values they had instilled in him. They had taught him the power of resilience, the importance of integrity, and the belief that justice was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. In time, the precinct transformed. New recruits joined, drawn by Malcolm's reputation for integrity and fairness. Officers who had once viewed him with suspicion came to respect him, recognizing that his leadership wasn't about power or control, but about creating a safe and just environment for everyone. The precinct became a model for other departments, its reforms setting a precedent for what policing could and should be. Years passed, and Malcolm continued to lead the force with the same principles that had guided him from the start. He remained a pillar in the community, known not just as a police chief but as a protector, a champion of justice, and a symbol of hope. The impact of his work extended far beyond the precinct, touching the lives of countless individuals who had once felt forgotten and overlooked. Havens Breads thrived as a community hub, a reminder of the journey the Walkers had endured and the legacy of resilience they had built. In the end, Malcolm's story was one of transformation, not just of a police department, but of a community and a family. His journey wasn't defined by vengeance or anger, but by a deep commitment to justice and a belief that change was possible. He had faced opposition, threats, and countless obstacles, but he had emerged stronger, a testament to the power of integrity and the enduring strength of those who stand for what is right. As he stood in his office one evening, looking out over the city he had vowed to protect, Malcolm felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His work was far from over, but he knew that he had already made a difference, that he had laid the foundation for a future built on fairness, respect, and compassion. And as he watched the city lights flicker in the distance, he knew that he had fulfilled the promise he had made to himself years ago, to honor his family's legacy, to protect his community, and to bring justice to a place that had long denied it. Malcolm Walker's journey was a reminder that real change takes time, that it requires courage and resilience. But above all, it showed that even in the face of prejudice and resistance, justice could prevail. And for Malcolm, that was worth every struggle, every sacrifice, and every moment of silent strength.